In the early 1950s, the National Park Service wanted to build a highway running on top of the old C&O Canal. Many people, including the editors of the Washington Post, supported that decision, and it seemed inevitable, but not to Supreme Court Justice William O. Douglas. In 1954, he challenged two Washington Post editors to hike with him along the 185 miles of canal. By exploring the canal together, Douglas's encounter with the Washington Post helped change the fate of the C&O Canal and helped it become the National Historical Park that we can enjoy today. Originally surveyed by George Washington, workers began building the Chesapeake and Ohio Canal in July of 1828. 22 years later, the canal was completed, establishing a trade route from Washington, D.C. to Cumberland, Maryland. Mules pulled boats as they walked along a towpath, transporting goods across the countryside. Families ran the locks, steered the boats, and lived on the canal for generations. Beginning in 1836, a series of short railroads were built next to the canal. Building and operating the railroads required much less labor, and they were significantly faster than the canal boats. Soon, the railroad industry left the canals in the dust. Floods frequently occurred around the canal, and it became harder and harder to maintain. After a terrible flood in 1924, all hopes of restoring the canal were abandoned, and the canal stopped operation permanently. With it, a vibrant culture centered around the canal disappeared.
He knew he was a part of history. You know how like a farmer can say, my family has farmed this land for 7 generations or whatever, and that's their land. Well, when I would play on the canal or on the towpath, I could always imagine my dad walking, with mules, and his dad and my grandfather walking on that same path.
Eventually, the canal land was transferred to the U.S. government. After World War II, the U.S. began a huge effort to develop interstate highways across America.
We're running out of roads. We didn't dream big enough.
In 1950, the Department of the Interior decided to replace the rundown canal with a highway running to D.C. It was the time of the Cold War, and the highway would provide another escape route from Washington, D.C. during a nuclear attack. It would take much less effort to build a highway in the C&O Canal, where the land had already been cleared, than to build it anywhere else in the area. The National Park Service supported the highway.
The Park Service was very enamored of roads, and they built the Skyline Parkway, they built the Blue Ridge Parkway, and they wanted to build this parkway up the C&O Canal. But my father and others, Justice Douglas included, thought that the long-term values of the canal were far more important than having just another highway because America was getting paved over.
He used to use the canal all the time, and he loved walking on the weekends and thinking about the various things that were going on in the court. It was a wonderful part of his life.
In 1954, an editorial in the Washington Post promoted the idea of the highway. A few conservationists were against the highway proposal. They wrote letters and published newspaper articles, but their efforts failed to sway the public opinion. The Washington Post's support made the proposal stronger, and Supreme Court Justice William O. Douglas decided to do something about it.
But the thing that ticked me off was an editorial that the Washington Post wrote that said, "We're glad that somebody has finally found a use for the C&O Canal, and the highway is long needed," and so on. So I wrote a letter to the editors of the Post, and it was a kind of, I thought, too hot a letter to send, so I put it in my desk drawer and looked at it a couple of days later, and it still looked pretty good to me, so I sent it off.
In his letter, Douglas invited the Washington Post editorial writers to come hike with him the entire 185 miles of canal towpath. Douglas hoped that once the reporters explored the canal with him and saw the incredible wildlife, they would change their minds. The editors said that they were pleased to accept Douglas's challenge. They had a difficult journey ahead of them. At first, Douglas only wanted a few people to hike with him, but he got about 600 applications in from people who wanted to go along. Howard Zahniser, the Wilderness Society Executive Secretary, helped Douglas gather and select influential people to come hike with him. On March 20th, 1954, at 8:30 in the morning, a group of 37 people set off in a rainstorm. It was the beginning of spring, and the weather was not kind to the hikers. The trek was so hard and strenuous that 4 people dropped out on the first day, and only 24 hikers remained after the second day. Sigurd Olsen, the president of the National Parks Association, had feet so swollen and blistered that he couldn't fit his boots on. The first few days, they encountered snow, rain, and some parts of the towpath that had washed away completely. The lockhouses were in bad shape. Some only had their foundation remaining. Yet instead of looking at what seemed hopeless, many of the hikers looked for what could be preserved. As they explored the overgrown canal, they saw amazing geological and historical features, and all sorts of wildlife. They saw 35 species of birds in one day.
Editors of the paper seemed surprised at how beautiful it was and wild and interesting it was. Some of their comments make you realize that it was a discovery for them that something like that was at the nation's back door. And I think it was a route of discovery because, among other things, I mean, you think of, a mule towpath out along the Potomac, but then you think, but it's right across from Harper's Ferry. Oh, but it goes into the Appalachian Mountains. It crosses the Piedmont Plain. It drops down by Great Falls and Little Falls to Tidewater and Georgetown. And you suddenly realize that it's an incredible sample of history and culture and natural history from the tidewaters to the Appalachians.
Douglas usually marched in the lead. He'd been hiking for 50 years, and it was a challenge for the others to keep up. The group went at a speed of about 3 miles an hour and walked an average of 23 miles a day. They had to spend most of their daylight hours walking in order to cover the long distance. To pass the time, the hikers made up new lyrics for the song, The Erie Canal. The hikers received a lot of attention from newspapers, television, and newsreels that played across the country. People came to express views from both sides of the encounter and cheered them on, or hiked along with them for a couple of days. As the hikers explored the canal, they also explored options for its future.
It was a great community outpouring, and ABC and CBS and NBC sent crews along, and to our great amazement, when we got to Washington, D.C., there were 50,000 people to greet us. It was as if we'd won some great big victory, you see. But the news of people walking was startling news, which is rather sad commentary on American life.
9 people, including Douglas, managed to hike the entire distance in only 8 days. The group was nicknamed the Immortal Nine. After exploring the canal's beauty, the reporters previously supporting the highway changed their minds. The Washington Post editors still didn't think the whole C&O should be protected, but they thought that parts of the canal should be preserved so people could hike it and learn about its history. The last night of the hike, the hikers decided there needed to be more action to save the canal. They created the C&O Canal Association and named Douglas chairman and Howard Zonheiser secretary. The 1954 hike changed the public's view of the canal, so it was not turned into a highway. However, that hike was only the beginning of the C&O Canal Association's 17-year-long struggle to preserve the canal. The C&O Canal Association arranged a hike every year along the towpath to encourage more people to explore the canal. Even 14 years later, when Douglas needed an electric pacemaker to stabilize his heartbeat, he continued hiking the C&O. Many of the hikers said they would keep walking the towpath until it became a National Historical Park.
So the Douglas group, people that walk with him, and then people like myself that joined him later, walk once a year just to call attention to the park, possibilities, to the canal. We need it to be preserved.
The C&O Canal Association tried to get a bill passed through Congress declaring the canal a National Historical Park 3 different times. None were successful.
And the congressmen and senators finally changed their minds, and bills were introduced, and they passed the Senate 3 times, and finally they passed the House. It took 17 years, but it was worth it.
On January 19th, 1971, the U.S. Congress passed Bill H.R. 19342, and the C&O Canal became a National Historical Park.
This year we have over 5 million visitors, putting us in the top 10 of most visited national parks.
In March of 1977, President Jimmy Carter dedicated the canal to Douglas. If the 1954 hike hadn't drawn attention to the beauty of the C&O Canal, it probably would have become just another highway route to Washington, D.C. The hikers' exploration of the canal instigated the series of events that eventually created 185 miles of park that people from all over the world can come and enjoy. The encounter between the Washington Post and Justice Douglas changed the nation's view of the C&O Canal and made it possible for the public to experience its rich history and beauty.